Have you ever seen a 78-year-old woman with no lawyer, no one to defend her, just sit silently in a courtroom and bring the entire legal system to its knees? This is not fiction. This is real, and it begins with a seemingly mundane trial where an old woman was convicted for sitting on her old porch. But what the judge, the prosecutor, and the courtroom didn't know was that he wasn't alone. Just one phone call. 4 whispered words. It's time. Bring them in. And from that moment, history was changed, buried truths were exposed, power was challenged, and a father seemingly relegated to the margins became a symbol of powerful silence. If you think justice only comes from the powerful, watch until the end. Because this time, the truth comes from a wooden chair and a heart that never gives up. Don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss the stories that make the world stop and listen. A man walks into a place where all eyes pass by as if he doesn't exist. The Silver Grove County Courthouse. An old red brick building in the heart of the city looks solemn and cold. But the truth is different. Inside, justice is not always present. Sometimes what is present is just prejudice, disguised under black robes and files that have never been read with the heart. That morning, no one thought about it when the old woman entered the courtroom. A few people looked up, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, to see what they thought was a gaunt old woman wearing a faded gray flannel shirt, old khaki pants with wrinkled knees, and dark brown leather shoes, the kind worn by women who lived modestly and cared little for luxury. Elias Morton, 74. She walked in unaided, unsupported. No attorney by her side, no familiar eyes watching from the bench. Just her and the soft click of her heels on the old wooden floor, each step carrying time, history, and something few in the room cared about the truth. As Elias walked toward the wooden table reserved for the defendant, everything in her was cautious, not out of fear, but because she knew she was entering a space where a nod, a frown, or even a glance at the ground would be enough to judge her whole person. In the auditorium, the chairs creaked. There were whispers, a few suppressed coughs. People whispered. Homeless people, probably. Old people clinging to the past. Why waste time with people like that? These words did not need to be spoken aloud. Elias heard them, as he had heard them all his life. From the hospital hallways when he drove his wife to cancer treatment, to the pews at church when he sat quietly at the back, to the times he went to the used bookstore. There were always people who questioned his presence. They did not need to know who he was. They only needed to see that he was black, old, and quiet. And they wrote a description of him. Loneliness was not having no one around. It was walking into a room full of people, and no one saw you. Elias took off his old cloth cap, his hands shaking with age, not with anxiety. He placed it gently on the edge of the table. A small gesture, but it spoke volumes about who he was respecting the place where he stood, even when it did not respect him. Up high behind the bar, Judge Ronald Keene sat upright like a living statue. He was 61, his gray hair neatly combed, his black robe hugging his large frame, making him seem more powerful than he actually was. Some judges handed down sentences with fairness, but Keene preferred to pass them with emotion, and emotion had never been kind to what he called social troublemakers. He didn't look at Elias right away. Instead, he read the file lazily, as if it were just another of the dozens he filed each day. Then he raised his head, meeting Elias's eyes. For a moment? Just a moment? Something wavered, but it was gone like wind blowing through glass. Keene smiled. He had seen this kind of person before, he thought. People who seemed small but had such pride that it was annoying. And what he hated most was dignity without legal papers. Mrs. Elias Morton, the judge's voice rang out dry as a bulletin board. Elias nodded. The defendant is charged with unlawful entry into the sealed property at 219 Aspen Street, which the city ordered demolished 18 months ago. Do you plead guilty? There was a pause. Elias did not rush to answer. It was not that he had not heard, it was that he was choosing his words the same way he had chosen the first brick when he built that house nearly 40 years ago. I sat on that step, Your Honor, she said, her voice even and low. No one spoke. Some sneezed. Some shook their heads in dismay. Judge Keene rested his chin on his hand, looking at Elias as if he were examining a foreign object. Why? It's sealed. It's not your home anymore. Elias didn't object, but it's the only place in the world that still feels right. The answer wasn't an explosion, but it spread like smoke into every corner of the courtroom. Someone in the audience looked down. A clerk stopped typing for a few seconds. There was a strange feeling, as if they had seen something they couldn't analyze with the law. Judge Keene slammed his hand on the table. Emotions don't make laws, Mr. Morton. The world doesn't operate on personal memories. Elias nodded, but she didn't bow, and that was what made the others uncomfortable. In that silence, the audience began to feel confused. No one was on Elias's side, but no one wanted to be on Keene's side either. The situation gradually lost its clarity. And when the law is no longer clear, people are forced to feel it with their hearts. And here Elias began to reclaim his space, not with evidence, not with lawyers, just by being completely quietly and without asking permission. The silence in the courtroom did not last long. Because in places like this, silence is not something people allow, but something they endure until they learn to control it. Judge Ronald Keene clasped his hands, his eyes shifting from the file to Elias, as if he were looking at a student who had not yet learned how to answer a question correctly. He took a breath, but the exhalation was loud enough for the room to understand he was starting to get angry. I told you emotions have no place here, he repeated this time in a lower voice but with a much colder tone. Elias remained standing, his hands clasped before his belly, his eyes unblinking, unflinching. She didn't need to say more. Because she had lived long enough to know words spoken in this courtroom are never heard with the ears. They are heard with prejudice. Judge Keene turned the page of the file with a deliberate gesture unnecessary but performative. It was his way of reinforcing his position, giving the impression that he was considering something, when in fact the decision had been made long before Elias had entered the room. Mrs. Morton, this is not your first offense, he said, his voice drawing out, trying to emphasize each word as if he were preaching. According to your record, you were warned once when you were found sitting on city property, the old fire station lot. Do you remember? Elias nodded. I do. And that time you just sat. The judge chuckled. Not a friendly laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from someone who is about to strike, like this time. A few people in the room chuckled. Not because they were amudged, but because they didn't want to feel awkward, and laughter is often the cheapest mask people wear when they don't know how to feel. Keene leaned forward with his elbows on the table. His voice dropped, not to be friendly, to get closer. Who do you think you are, Mr. Morton? A sage. A symbol to be revered for a past no one knows about. No response. You have entered property that does not belong to you. No reason, no memory. And now you stand here, without a lawyer, without a defense, without any record of ownership. Do you know what you are doing? Elias answered softly, almost in a whisper, I am remembering. That answer made the air in the room pause for a beat, but Keene did not let it linger. He slammed the file down on the table. This courtroom is not a place for nostalgia. This is a place for the law to be enforced. Elias's eyes did not leave Keene's face. No fear, no defiance. There was only an endless weariness that in his entire life people had never asked him why he was anywhere. They had only asked, what right do you have to be there? In the back, a court clerk handed over additional paperwork. Keene took it, but didn't look at it. He already knew what he was going to do. Since there was no defense attorney, and the defendant admitted to being in the restricted area, The court finds that you have violated Rule 4712 on trespassing on public property. Elias did not respond. Do you have anything to say before I pass judgment? The room fell silent. Some people bowed their heads. A few eyes avoided Elias, as if afraid to catch the truth inside the man. Elias opened his mouth slowly. I built that house. I poured the foundation, raised the pillars, laid the bricks, laid every stone in it with these hands. He raised his hands, the knuckles trembling, the calluses silently closing like the scars of war. And I lost my wife in that house, right there on the bed, under the south window. She closed her eyes for the last time, while the afternoon light filtered through the pale pink curtains. There was a soft intake of breath. A young man in the last row swallowed, not understanding why he suddenly wanted to bow to someone he had thought of as an intruder a few minutes ago. Elias continued. Not quickly, not shakily, but firmly. I haven't forgotten anything, Your Honor. I just didn't want anyone else to forget that I was there. And then Judge Keene did what he always did when he was pushed into a corner where he couldn't respond rationally. He responded with power. 30 days in the county jail. Starting immediately, the verdict fell like a decisive hammer of fate. No one expected it. No one thought that sitting on the steps of a house that once belonged to you was enough to get you thrown in jail. A few people jumped up, shocked. A clerk stopped typing, looking up at the judge as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. But Keene didn't turn around. He just looked at Elias triumphantly, as if he had just disciplined someone who dared not bow to the system. Elias didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. Just standing there, like a nameless monument in the storm, not wanting to be remembered, only hoping not to be erased. And then he said a single sentence. I know I have been preparing for this day for a long time. The anger in the audience did not come from screaming, but from suffocation. They did not see a criminal. They saw a lonely, silent man, buried under the thick ash of the system, and called a criminal by people who had never asked who he was. And that anger was boiling, but it had not yet exploded, because Elias remained silent, because he had one card left to play, and that phone call had not yet come. Part 3. The call before going to jail. As Judge Ronald Keene prepared to close the case and move on to a new trial, the tone in the courtroom began to change. It was no longer the high-pitched whispers or the soft singing in the wind. It was a quiet, almost constricting silence, as if someone had just huddled in a dim, empty space. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room, leaving behind heavy breathing. Elias Morton stood there silent, his hands still folded across his chest like an old man preparing to pray. He made no protest. He did not ask for leniency. There was only one thing he wanted. Before I go, Your Honor, may I make a phone call? His voice was calm and even, like someone asking someone to open the door to a hospital room. No rush, no tremor, no excuse. But everyone sensed it clearly. This was no sudden request. It was a carefully calculated move, saved for the last possible moment. Judge Keene smirked. He tilted his head to one side as if testing his self-imposed patience. Call 30 seconds maximum. The bailiff hesitated, then took the phone from his pocket and handed it to Elias with a suggestive sense of humor. Don't order an Uber, sir. But Elias didn't smile. He took the phone, tapping the number with his fingers so slowly that it seemed as if he had forgotten how to use it. No contacts, no scrolling, just hard numbers drawn from memory like a stylus. The bell rang. Ring, ring! The courtroom fell silent. Even the child sitting in the back seat stopped fiddling with his fingers. A few people bowed their heads and listened, not out of curiosity, but because they intuitively knew this moment was important. Unusual. And then Elias put the phone to his ear, his voice steady, not trembling, not pleading, just as solid as rock. It's time, bring all the trouble. Just 4 words. No one understood. But in his eyes, in the decisive gesture of closing the phone, everyone knew that call was not for explanation. It was a signal and order. Elias hung up. He handed the phone back to the bailiff with a calm nod. No one understood what he meant. Bring all the trouble. Who bring what? Why, there was no answer. There was only anticipation creeping in like a faded paintbrush through dry eyes. Judge Keene looked at him for a moment, then coordinated with the bailiff. Take him to the jail. Next session. But just then, the door to the courtroom opened, the sound of high heels clicking on the marble floor, click, click, click. At the sound, the whole room turned, and they saw her. In half a minute, the space that had been tilted toward the judge had hollowed out. The atmosphere seemed to flip, from stifling to urgent, from sinking to explosive. Ariana Morton, 40 years old. Elias's daughter, congresswoman, former military lawyer who had represented many high-profile cases in the country. The only girl left in the family, and the one Elias had patiently kept from calling until he absolutely needed her. She walked in like a leader stepping up to the podium without anxiety, without avoidance, without reminding herself what she had to prove. Her eyes scanned the courtroom as if surveying the battlefield. Each glance that touched her face was a breathtaking mark. Behind her, 3 men in sharp suits followed. The symbols of a famous lawyer. In their hands, the truth. And what they brought was more than just papers. It was preparation. It was consequences. Elias was not surprised. He only nodded slightly when Ariana placed her hand on his shoulder. She did not need to say, "I'm here, don't worry, Father," because that hand spoke for her. That phone call, it was not a plea for help. It was a signal, and it was starting to change everything. As for Judge Keene, he began to blink rapidly. He had never seen anyone enter the courtroom like that, not bowing, not pleading, but as if holding the weight of justice in his hands. The courtroom was silent. The atmosphere was as tense as a string. No one knew what was coming, but everyone felt this was no longer an ordinary trial. This was the beginning of a storm. The air in the courtroom began to tighten, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something that could not be named. All eyes were no longer on Elias Morton, but on the woman who had just appeared, like a bolt of lightning in a clear sky. Ariana Morton, in her tight black suit, walked steadily to the center of the courtroom, as if she were the one who controlled this space. The 3 lawyers behind her were not satellites, but fortresses, figures who were not only familiar to the legal profession, but had also caused many high-ranking officials to resign after congressional hearings. Judge Ronald Keene rose, adjusting his collar, as if an electric current had just run through his spine. He tried to keep his voice calm, but there was a confused echo. "This hearing is over, if you do not have a special reason to be present." Ariana did not stop. No excuse, no explanation. She walked straight to the defense table, placing her hand lightly on her father's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to redraw the lines of authority. Elias looked up at her without saying a word. They understood each other. His slight nod seemed to pave the way for a long-planned counterattack. She turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, before any execution is carried out, there are some documents that I believe you need to review." "Who are you?" Keene asked a little harshly. One of the 3 attorneys stepped forward gently, placing a file thicker than the state criminal code on the bench. "Ariana Morton, Federal Senator Senior Counsel, and legal representative of my client, Mr. Elias Morton." Judge Keene reached out and touched the file as if touching a block of ice. He opened the first pages, his eyes shifting from contempt to wariness. And then a line of text appeared, clearly printed, notarized, stamped with the seal of the land office. Property 1129, Sycamore Street, never completed, still owned by Elias Morton through his late wife's power of attorney. The silence was heavy as if shot through. A few people in the audience began to lean forward to look. A court clerk stopped typing, his hands hovering in the air. Even the prosecutor, who had been sitting with a stern expression, turned his head slowly, his eyes wavering. Ariana still hadn't said another word, but she stepped forward, pointing at the file. These papers included the unconveyed title, the erroneous legal notes that labeled the house condemned, and Mr. Morton's honorable record as a former chief architect of the Department of Defense, who had advised the government on disaster reconstruction. Keen's fingertips began to tremble slightly. He turned the page. Then another. The name Elias Morton appeared everywhere, not as a defendant, but as the creditor, the owner, the builder of the place where he was being tried. The truth did not just turn the trial upside down. It turned the trial upside down. This, Keen stammered. Have these documents been verified? They have all been notarized, authenticated by the land registry, and checked by the legal team at Warren and Grant, LLP. One of the three lawyers replied. Ariana did not stop there. She took a step further. In addition, Mr. Morton himself had never received any formal legal notice of the transfer of ownership. This made any accusation of illegal entry unfounded. The room seemed to tilt toward her, not because she was a congresswoman, not because she was Elias's daughter, but because the truth was now being presented like a sword slashing down on the courtroom table. The prosecutor sitting on the other side coughed slightly, stood up, and said slowly, "Your Honor. Given the circumstances, the prosecutor's office requests a stay of execution pending further review." Ariana turned to him, her eyes not angry but admonishing. "Not further review." It was a revocation. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Keen clenched his fists, his eyes shifting from bewilderment to defense. He knew that if he persisted for another second, he would not only face a miscarriage of justice, he would face an ethics investigation. He tapped the wooden table. I will consider this new data." "Not consider," Ariana interrupted. "But do the right thing now." Her voice was not high, but it was like an indictment. No need to shout, no need to plead, just decisiveness. Elias stood there, not smiling, not shedding tears. He only let out a very small breath. But to those who knew him, that breath meant the tolling of a bell, the end of the wait. No longer the old man sitting silently on the steps of memory. Elias Morton was now a living witness to a justice that had almost been bent. The whole courtroom was filled with shock, but also with respect. No one stood up. No one applauded. But everyone understood a silent earthquake had just occurred, and the epicenter was the old man's 4 words. "It's time, bring all the trouble." And it was true. Trouble had come, but not for Elias Morton, but for the very system that had tried to bury him. Outside courtroom 6, the Meriden County Courthouse was no longer the quiet place for daily court hearings. Keyboards were tapping, cameras were flashing, and live television was streaming in. Reporters from local to national news stations had gathered less than an hour after Elias Morton's signaled call. The news spread like wildfire. Former defense architect wrongly convicted Rep. Ariana Morton overturned in court. Judge Keen faces ethics investigation. The headlines flashed across cell phone screens, online message boards, and even the loudspeakers in the coffee shop down the street. In the courtroom, the shock had barely subsided when another wave of emotion hit anger. Not a furious rage, but a simmering resentment built up from the contemptuous glances, the fateful hammering, the heartless judgment of a system that was built to protect, not break. A brown woman in the 4th row held her husband's hand. He was a veteran who had fought with Elias's unit in the 1970s. Their eyes were no longer skeptical, but awakened. Because if Elias Morton, who had always lived a quiet, exemplary life and contributed, could be trampled by the words, "You have no right," then any of them could be next. Ariana could feel the change in the atmosphere. She turned to look at her father, as if asking silently, "Are you ready?" Elias nodded. The nod of a man who had been through bombs, betrayed by the country he helped build, but still stood firm on his own 2 feet. She took another step forward, facing Keene directly. No more pleadings. The start of the counter-hearing. Your Honor, I am requesting that the transcript of this trial be made public immediately and that the entire case be referred to the State Ombudsman. We are also filing a formal complaint about Mr. Keene's handling of the case. A murmur filled the courtroom. Keene was at a loss. You have no authority to do that in a district court. I have the authority to do that as a citizen, as an attorney, as a federal lawmaker, and as the daughter of the man you almost ruined. Ariana didn't speak loudly, but the words were metallic, cold enough to cut through any pretense, clear enough for everyone to hear. The young prosecutor bowed her head and said nothing. She knew she had followed procedure, but the truth of the day was evident. Process without compassion can be a weapon of wrong. A small clap. Then another. Then the whole courtroom burst into applause, not in celebration but in anger. To say they saw, they heard, and they were not complicit. Keene tried to keep his composure, but his face began to turn red. The judge, who had once prided himself on being the toughest man in the state, was slowly becoming small. I never meant to offend Mr. Morton, he protested. I was only following the law. Elias Morton spoke for the first time. The law is not a stick to beat anyone with, Mr. Keene. The law is a shield to protect the voiceless, and today you used it like a hammer to beat me down on the head without even knowing who I was. He didn't sound angry, but each word was nailed into the minds of the room. The silence that followed was no longer tense, but embarrassing. Judge Keene fell silent, Ariana continued. And we won't stop there. She turned to the waiting reporters. Her voice was now directed not just at Keene, but at America. If a man like my father could be treated like that, then the system is fundamentally flawed. And if you're outraged, don't just share a tweet. Demand answers. Hold those who are supposed to be the judges accountable. Outside the courthouse, a crowd began to gather. Some held signs that said, "Justice for Elias." Others wore T-shirts with the house number 1129 Sycamore, the place where the storm began, and the silence ended. From all over the state, people who had been wrongly convicted, who had been stopped without cause, who had been called by their eyes instead of their names, they came because Elias Morton was no longer a name. He was a symbol. Judge Keene, standing by the bench, lowered his eyes, trembling. He tried to avoid them. But the eyes from the audience, the eyes that had once bowed in fear, now looked straight at him, and no one forgave him. At the end of the hearing that day, Ariana said nothing. She simply took her father's hand and walked out of the room as if they had never been dragged into the abyss of injustice. They didn't walk fast, but each step made the wooden floor beneath their feet vibrate like a wake-up call. Elias Morton didn't need honors. He just wanted the truth to be restored. And today that truth had shaken the system. But as they reached the door of the courtroom, a court clerk rushed up, phone in hand. Face ashen. Ms. Morton, CNN is waiting for you to go live. They say this event has been #1 nationally. Ariana nodded. But before leaving, she turned to look at Judge Keene, who was still standing like a statue. This is not the end, Mr. Keene. This is only the first wake-up call. Behind her, chants began to echo from the square. We are Elias. We are the truth. A wave of anger had just been awakened, and this time they did not turn back. The fight for justice was no longer in the hands of one person. It had become the voice of the entire community. As the courtroom doors closed behind Elias Morton and his daughter Ariana, the shock waves were just beginning. The media were no longer simply reporting. They were becoming heat pipes for a fireball called truth. A truth that had been buried under the dust of the system, now rising with ferocity. In front of the courthouse, the crowd grew. Live television coverage of the scene was beamed across the country. On the CNN screen, a bold banner read, "A father, a hero, wrongly convicted." Scrolling text below it read, "Elias Morton, wrongly convicted because of a systemic error, a national outcry." Ariana stood before the camera, the spotlight shining directly on her determined face. She wasn't reading from a piece of paper. She didn't need notes. Her words were true, as vivid as the blood in her heart. My father was judged not for what he did, but because people thought they knew who he was. A black man, old, silent, harmless. And because of that silence, he was relegated to the don't care box. But today, that silence ended, and it was replaced by truth. A wave of applause and chants erupted behind her. A New York television producer turned to a colleague and whispered, "This will go down in history books." Not because it was so strange, but because it was so familiar. But this time, no one dared to turn away. On Twitter, the hashtags #justice. For Elias and I stand with. Morton were in the top 3 after just an hour. Video clips from the trial. Elias's calm gaze, Ariana's sharp words, Judge Keen's broken expression were shared millions of times. Universities held emergency forums. Civil rights lawyers spoke on MSNBC. People who had been hurt by the system began telling their stories. A middle-aged white man, a former police officer from Ohio, said on a podcast, "I have seen how we, people in the profession, sometimes judge people by their looks. The Elias case makes me shudder, because I know I used to be like Keen. Not malicious, but insensitive." A law student in California wrote, "I used to want to be a judge, but today I understand that to do that, I have to relearn how to look at people." It wasn't just in the media and academia that social organizations took immediate action. The National Lawyers Guild issued an urgent statement calling for a re-examination of the sentences Keen had presided over. They also set up a hotline to receive similar complaints. Within 48 hours, there were more than 1,000 calls. Many of them are old stories that were thought to be buried people convicted for sitting in the wrong place, wearing questionable clothes, or simply because they didn't have a good lawyer or a daughter like Ariana Morton. And in the center of that storm, Elias Morton chose not to hide. Despite being invited to appear on major talk shows, he only appeared once in an interview broadcast from the front steps of his own home, 29 Sycamore. "I'm not a victim. I'm proof that the truth, if denied long enough, will knock harder. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to sit where I belong." That simple statement was broadcast in thousands of news reports. It carried more weight than any eloquent speech. Meanwhile, the Connecticut legal system began to shake. The state Supreme Court held an emergency session. Judge Keen's case was put on the bench. State legislators, under pressure from voters, began to propose Morton's Law, a law that would force new trials in cases involving biased judgments. Longtime activists who had marched in the streets decades earlier stood with the younger generation. A photo of an octogenarian black woman holding a sign reading, "I was Elias" in 1968 became a new symbol. It appeared on the cover of Time, with the caption, "Memory is not yet asleep." In Congress, Ariana Morton was invited to testify. During the live hearing, she stood in the middle of the solemn hall, her hand on the document, her eyes fixed on the members of the Judiciary Committee. "This is no longer my father's story. This is your opportunity to prove that justice is not just for the powerful or the lucky. It is for all citizens, no matter how old they are, what their race or where they stand in society." After the speech, a row of senators, both parties, stood and applauded. An elderly woman shed tears. A man who had been a strong opponent of judicial reform whispered, "She reminds me of my daughter." At the Sycamore house, Elias sat on the porch. A neighbor boy came up to him with a crayon drawing. Mr. Morton sitting on the steps holding up a piece of paper with the words, "Truth wins. I drew this for you. I told you about it in class today." Elias looked at the drawing, his eyes lighting up. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you. You did the right thing. We have to tell the right stories, and don't let anyone else write the ending." Across the street, a group of young people put up posters. "We are the Elias generation. We demand justice." An independent film production company has also announced that it is developing a documentary called The Porch, which will chronicle the entire case and what followed. The director, who grew up in the same neighborhood as Elias, says, "I'm making this film so that my children will understand that justice doesn't come from above. It comes from the courage to stand up when others are silent." The media is no longer talking about a strange case. They're talking about a historical movement, the rise of voices that were once silenced. And Elias Morton, who just wanted to sit on his old porch, has now inadvertently awakened the nation. No one can pretend not to know. No one can turn a blind eye to the truth anymore. Not everyone can withstand the light of truth. And for Judge Leonard Keene, it was more than just blinding. It burned down a seemingly impregnable career. Soon after Ariana Morton's documents were released to the public, a special panel of the Connecticut Judicial Review Board was convened. Its members included senior judges, former prosecutors, and representatives from the U.S. Department of Justice, all of whom agreed to re-examine Keene's biased or discriminatory rulings during his 22 years on the bench. The media didn't miss a beat. The Atlantic ran the headline, "One Man. One silence, one fall." Meanwhile, the New Yorker devoted an entire issue to the state's long-hidden miscarriages of justice, with Keene dominating the cover, his face overshadowed by Elias's. Keene, once known for having the highest conviction rate in the state, is now suspended indefinitely. He is no longer allowed to work on active cases, while the Judicial Integrity Commission conducts an internal investigation into more than 180 convictions he has presided over, some of which have resulted in people serving more than 10 years in prison. Lawyers for those wrongfully convicted filed appeals. News reports were filled with images of weeping relatives outside the courthouse, clutching copies of court records, hoping for belated justice. At a news conference, the state attorney general acknowledged, "We can't turn back the clock, but we have a responsibility to make sure no one else suffers like Elias Morton." As for Keene, he declined to be interviewed. His large home in suburban Hartford was quiet, the curtains drawn. Neighbors began whispering and avoiding eye contact as they walked by. He has gone from being a gatekeeper of justice to a symbol of the corruption of power. A local journalist described, "The pressure has not only come from outside a group of alumni of Yale Law School, where Keene once taught as a visiting professor, wrote an open letter demanding that the school end all academic ties with him." The letter garnered more than 3,000 signatures in just 24 hours. Yale Law School later declared education cannot be above the truth. NPR has released a special podcast, Keene's Courtroom: A Lost Version of Justice. The podcast features interviews with people who were wrongly convicted by Keene. One man says, his voice shaking, "I remember the look in his eyes. He looked at me like I was a number, not a person." But if the punishment for Keene is necessary, the change that the Morton family is leading is even more important. After a historic hearing, Ariana Morton and a bipartisan group of lawmakers formally introduced a bill named after her father, the Morton Act, in the State House of Representatives. The bill calls for comprehensive retraining for judges, including training on unconscious bias, racial equity, and ethical obligations in trial. It also calls for expanded access to justice for the elderly, low-income, and minority communities. Ariana, though not a politician, became the spokesperson for the reform movement. She spoke not as someone looking for victory, but as someone who had seen something that needed to be fundamentally changed. "We are not here for revenge. We are here to fix it." When she said that in the House of Representatives, the entire room rose, not out of ceremony, but because they knew that this was no longer a bill. This was a chance for collective redemption. With overwhelming public support, the Morton Act passed the State House with a near-unanimous vote. Then the Senate, and finally the signature of the governor, who declared, "Today's history is written by truth, not by power. A special budget was allocated to implement an independent judicial review system, where any citizen could request a review of a judgment if there was evidence of bias or judicial misconduct. Meanwhile, Elias Morton continued to live a simple life. He still sat on his front steps every morning, drinking tea and chatting with his neighbors. But now everyone who passed by stopped and put their hand over their heart as a silent greeting. One morning, a group of high school students came to visit him. They were members of the Living History Club. They wanted to hear about the trial. Elias smiled. "You don't need to hear that again. Let me tell you what I learned from that trial. That justice, when it has lost its way, will return if someone holds a lamp." Ariana sat in the back, watching her father silently. She knew they hadn't finished their journey. There were still people like Elias, silent, sidelined, waiting to be heard, and they wouldn't have to wait much longer. At a national legal conference in Boston, Elias was invited to speak as a living witness to the failures and hopes of the system. "On stage," he said in a deep voice, "when you sit on the bench, do not look at people with the eyes of the law. Look at them with the eyes of fairness. The law is not a net to catch the weak. It is a stick to lift up the fallen." That line has been quoted thousands of times. It has become a slogan printed on T-shirts of law students across the country. Because now no one can say I don't know. Elias Morton has forced an entire system to open its eyes, and now it is being forced to change. Change came not just from the legislative chambers, but from old street corners, park benches, and communities that had been ignored for too long. When Elias Morton's story spread, it shook not only the benches of judges, but also awakened a generation. The neighborhood where Elias lived, once called the city's Downs because of high unemployment and crumbling infrastructure, became a symbol of rebirth. Nonprofits began investing in old houses, renovating them into community centers and open libraries. A community garden called Morton's Garden was established in the heart of the neighborhood. Children came to plant vegetables, and elders gathered to chat under the trees. At the entrance to the garden, there was a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "Where there was silence, there are now voices heard." One of the most notable initiatives is the Next Generation Justice Program, where law students and high school students connect with community elders to hear stories, learn about forgotten histories, and rewrite those memories into books, paintings, and short films. At the local cultural center, an exhibition called History of the Forgotten displays old photographs, handwritten letters, and diaries of residents who were wrongly convicted or left out of the system. Next to each exhibit is the inscription, "I was an Elias too." Classes on citizenship, basic legal rights, and judicial advocacy skills are offered evening discussion groups under the soft yellow lights of the church's backyard are no longer about frustration, but about direction. Young people are starting to ask, "If I were sitting on the judge's bench, how would I judge?" Ariana Morton, who still works as a financial professional, spends her free time traveling the state, not to talk about pain, but about hope. She encourages schools to form justice dialogue groups, and she starts the Ask Before Judge campaign, a social movement that encourages people to ask questions instead of making snap judgments. An independent film production company has announced that it will make a documentary called The Last Man Standing, which will chronicle Elias's entire journey from his arrest to the passing of the Morton Act. The film will not use famous actors, but instead cast real people from the community to reenact the scenes. This is not a movie, they say. This is reality filmed. Elias Morton never thought his name would be on the pages of a textbook, but that's exactly what happened. 12th graders in Hartford are now getting a special lesson in their local history class about the Elias Morton case, about the role of citizens in monitoring justice, and about how a loud enough voice can change the course of events. A teacher tearfully concluded the lesson. "I used to teach you that justice is right. Now I teach you that justice sometimes has to be won. In Central Park, a bust of Elias Morton stands, not with the traditional stern look, but with a gentle smile, looking forward. At the base of the statue is engraved a quote from him. "Don't look at me as someone who won. Look at me as someone who didn't back down." The sky was clear on the day the statue was unveiled. Hundreds of people came. Some brought flowers. Some brought photos of him from the days when he sat alone in court, and someone, an older woman, brought an old wooden chair. This is the chair that Elias sat on the porch. I think it deserves to be here. They placed the chair under the tree next to the statue. Every day someone sat on it, not in memory, but in reflection. Local writers began writing short stories inspired by Elias's journey. A play was performed at a small local theater about a man who stood silently in the face of power and how he made power bow. Tickets sold out in 2 days. Critics called it the play of a nation learning to apologize. A prestigious university invited Elias to speak at the graduation ceremony. On stage, he said, "Go out there and do the right thing. Not because you will be rewarded, but because if you don't, someone will suffer." The entire hall stood up and applauded, not as usual, but as if to say, "We get it." Not stopping there, many places took inspiration from the Hartford model to establish community heritage centers, places to store memories, documentaries, testimonies, and testimonies of people who have been oppressed by systemic prejudice. Each center has a special room called the Silent Truth Room, a dark space with only the sound of real stories from people like Elias echoing in soft lighting. No screens, no images, just voices, so people have to listen. Soon, student and community groups began organizing annual memorial walks called Morton's Walk, where people walk together through locations associated with the case, carrying candles, photos, and pledges. Each step is a vow not to forget, not to ignore, not to repeat. A major New York newspaper ran a 4-page story headlined "From Bench to Podium: The Man Who Made America Sit Up and Listen." On social media, a new trend began to blossom. Young people posted pictures of themselves sitting silently on wooden benches, from coffee shops to public libraries, with the hashtag "Im Lang de Duok Lang," in memory of Elias, and sending the message that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the noblest form of resistance. Elias's story does not end in legal documents. It lives on in the way a community moves forward after pain. It lives on in every child's gaze at the statue and asks, "Who was he?" And someone will answer, "He was the one who reminded us that the truth cannot be silenced forever." Time has passed, but Elias Morton's story has never faded. It has not been forgotten. Like so many other cases buried in legal files and unread transcripts. Instead, it has slowly spread, seeping into the collective consciousness as a reminder of what happens when a society refuses to listen to its most silent. When Elias Morton died at the age of 83, he was no longer a misunderstood man, but a hero of our time. His funeral was not a place for mourning, but a proud ceremony where people from all walks of life gathered to pay their respects. Some brought flowers, some brought notebooks, filled with lessons from his journey. But everyone came with one thing in common: respect. The ceremony took place in the city's central square. The former courthouse, where he was unjustly convicted. Today, it was decorated not with laws, but with white daisies and a banner. The truth does not need to scream. It just needs to stand. Jacqueline Morton, the girl who changed the course of the case with a phone call and a file, stepped up to the podium. Without tears, her voice trembled slightly. "My father never wanted to be honored. He just wanted to be recognized. Today, when he is no longer here. The only thing I hope is that we not only carve his name in stone, but also carve awareness in our hearts." She pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, an excerpt from the letter Elias left behind. "I never wanted to be a symbol, but if my story makes someone look up at themselves, then my silence is not in vain." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. No bells, no music, just absolute silence. And then, like a wave, people began to place their hands on his statue, gently touching his bronze shoulder, as if to say a final thank you. Soon after, the city announced a momentous decision, naming a new high school the Elias Morton School of Justice, where students would learn about justice not just through books, but through real life. Every student entering the school was given a handbook with a quote from him. "You don't have to speak loudly to be heard. You just have to speak the truth." The local justice system also made sweeping changes, establishing a justice oversight board made up of community representatives, public defenders, and people who had been victims of legal injustice. Every sentence was now weighed not just by the law, but by the heart. As for former Judge Gerald Vance, who had sentenced Elias after the incident that year, he retired early not to avoid it, but to face it. He published a memoir called In the Judge's Eye. In it, he wrote, "I thought justice was in my hands, but it turned out to be in the eyes I didn't dare look at. Elias didn't need to win me over, he just needed me to look back." The book didn't sell well, but it was included in the judicial training program in several states. As a reminder that power must be accompanied by humility, a major conference called Justice is Not Silent was held in Washington, D.C. with hundreds of speakers, scholars, activists, and students from all over. The opening session began not with a speech, but with a recording of Elias's voice, as he said in court years ago. "I just sat on the porch, but I stood firm in my truth, and the whole room stood up. Not for the speech, but for that truth, simple but unyielding." In another corner of the country, a father took his young son to a park, pointed to a statue of Elias, and said, "You know, this is not a celebrity. This is the right guy," and the child silently nodded. Soon after, a federal law was proposed, inspired by the Elias Morton case, that would require all trials of non-violent crimes involving senior citizens to have local community representatives consult before making a decision. It was a small step, but it began with a big step, Elias. Many judicial review boards began a Defendant for a Day programs where judges, lawyers, and law students would role-play and reenact the experiences of those who had been wrongly convicted. As a result, many of them walked out of the rehearsal room with red eyes and a different heart than when they entered. An Emmy-winning director announced he was making a biopic about Elias Morton. But when Jacqueline met him, she simply said, "If you're going to make a movie about my father, start with him sitting on an old wooden chair staring at the sun, because that's when he was at his strongest." A TEDx talk by a young college student inspired by Elias went viral. He ended with the following: "They asked me how can one person change the system? I said by not letting the system change you first." The story of Elias Morton doesn't end with a conviction being overturned. It ends with a society that begins to listen, and in that world, silence is no longer seen as weakness, but as a form of strength when it is protected by truth. Elias' legacy is not in the number of days he was on trial, but in every moment he refused to give up. It is in the eyes of those who once stood on the sidelines and now step into the center carrying truth and faith. And when someone asks, "What did he leave us?" we can answer, "He left us a way to stand up without shouting, just standing." But the legacy is not limited to words. It has spread into a web of concrete actions, community projects, and real changes in the legal system and education. A foundation called the Morton Initiative for Dignity and Justice was established by Jacqueline Morton and philanthropists across the country. It funds community lawyer training programs, provides free legal aid to seniors and minorities, and provides scholarships to law students committed to serving underserved communities. At the Library of Congress, a permanent exhibition called One Man, One Truth, The Legacy of Elias Morton, has opened. It features the wooden chair he sat in the file that overturned the conviction and copies of the letters citizens sent to Jacqueline after the historic trial, including the line, "I taught my child that justice was silent. Now I teach him that justice speaks." A park named after Elias in his hometown of Georgia, with a community center serving African American families, offers classes on citizenship, basic legal education, and group therapy for those who have experienced injustice. On the outside wall is a bronze inscription: "My silence is not submission. It is waiting for the right moment to speak." Many national education curricula have also been updated. In the new 12th grade civics textbook, a chapter dedicated to the Elias Morton case is included as a lesson on judicial ethics and the value of social criticism. Some students called it the chapter that made me want to be a better person. At federal congressional hearings on judicial reform, Elias Morton's name is often mentioned as a living symbol of quiet courage, one senator exclaimed during a session. "We don't need to wait for another Elias Morton to realize that this system needs to change today." Shortly after, another bill was passed that expanded access to legal counsel for low-income seniors and people of color. The Elias Act. Outside the United States. Elias Morton's story has been translated into more than 30 languages, reaching universities, think tanks, and human rights organizations around the world. In Oslo, Norway, the International Peace Institute hosted a conference called "The Silent Reformers, People Who Change the World Without Raising Their Voices," with Elias Morton's image prominently featured in the backdrop. Even in popular culture, his name has become a source of inspiration. A song called "Porch of Justice," written by a young black woman, topped the charts for weeks with the catchphrase, "You don't have to go out into the streets, just sit back, straighten your back, and let justice come to you." The online community created the Stand Like Elias challenge on TikTok, where users filmed themselves standing tall and silent, sometimes in a crowd, sometimes in front of symbols of power, a reminder that steadfastness doesn't require volume. It just requires truth. Finally, Jacqueline Morton, speaking at a ceremony marking the 5th anniversary of her father's exoneration, said, "I used to think my father had lost so much to the system, but now I realize he left more to the world than any sentence could ever take away." She looked toward his bronze statue among the crowd, standing silently, no one saying a word. But in that silence, something was spreading: a new faith, an unspoken promise, and an undeniable legacy. Are you angry? Do you feel a lump in your throat, unable to believe that a 78-year-old man was sent to prison for sitting on the porch of the house he built with his own hands? We have just witnessed a story that is heartbreaking but familiar, not because it is rare, but because it happens all too often. Elias Morton is not the first person to be looked at with prejudice, judged before he is even heard, and he will not be the last. If we do not act. Remember the scene where he stood, back straight, hands clasped in front of his stomach, eyes unafraid. No excuses, no pleas, no boos. While the entire system, from the powerful judge to the indifferent people in the back row, had already decided his fate. Elias remained silent, but not because he was weak, but because he knew the truth does not need to be shouted. It just needs the right moment. And when he said 4 words, "It's time, bring them in," the whole society was startled awake. The question is, without the daughter who is a congresswoman, without the series of documents to prove it, without the media coverage, would Elias have been free? Or would he have left that courtroom like so many other anonymous people, quietly, unjustly, and forgotten by history? This is not just a father's story. This is an indictment of prejudice. A wake-up call to all of us. Those who still think that natural justice will come, that this society is inherently fair. No, justice does not come by itself. It needs to be reclaimed. It needs to be seen, heard, and protected. By all means, by each person. If you find this story infuriating, show it. Like to stand on the side of truth. Comment your feelings, because every voice has power. And if you want to join us in continuing to spread the brave, honest stories that touch millions, then subscribe to our channel now, because there will be other Elias Morton's people who are silent, but carry a truth that no one is willing to listen to. And when they speak up, or just stand up straight, make sure you are there. Ready to listen. Ready to act. Our channel, where the truth is never forgotten